Okay, welcome. Keith, are we ready to go here? Welcome to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. And I want to share just a little bit of the chatter that we've had in the room so far already this morning. At this table over here was asking, why is Ezekiel in the Bible? Right? What do we get by having this prophet in the Bible? And so I'm hoping we'll get a chance to get to discussion of that question. What is his contribution to this canon? Why is there so much weirdness in here? And then over at this table, Mark said, this is a day with a lot of uncanny for the good, the bad, and the uncanny. We're also going to encounter I'm going to say we're also going to encounter a lot of good, but we're definitely also going to encounter a lot of bad. So this is going to be a complex and complicated class because we've got a complex and complicated prophet on our hands, and I am excited to dive into this with you. And welcome if you are joining us online. Couple of announcements this morning. We've got a great interview with Maggie Odell on the book of Ezekiel. She'll explain all the parts that I can't or won't explain to you. So make sure to catch that interview on our website. Discussion groups will meet this week, Wednesday, the 24th of January, in person in the Meisel Room and online on Zoom. The link to that is in the Adult Ed e-blast. Email Michael Gold if you're not on that subscription list. That's how you get your link. So please join us for that, especially if you have questions. I hope you will have questions. There's a lot to have questions about in this book. The spring reading guide is available. A couple of you emailed me and said, do I need to read the entire book of Ezekiel? No, and there are some chapters I'd rather you not read. And so on the back table beneath the basketball hoop, there is a reading guide for the spring of, if you're reading along but want to read selections rather than the whole book, you can find it there. Coming up on February 4th, we have our Faith Nixon lecture. Faith Nixon was a pioneer of women's ministries here at Westminster, left an enduring legacy of programming here and also in terms of retreats. Question for the group, do you have to be a woman to go to the Faith Nixon lecture? No, you don't. You do go on the spring retreat, but the lecture is open to everybody, and I would recommend that everybody go. We have Louise Matson with us, who is the executive director of the Division of Indian Work. This is one of the 5 organizations that was a recipient of the mission component of the Enduring Hope campaign. So this is where some of the money that went to building the very room you're sitting in, right, also went out into the community. This is one of those organizations. Come on February 4th to that lecture. And then for Lent, coming up in Lent, we're doing Church in the Round again, and we are just about, in this class, getting to the Psalms. And so what Church in the Round is going to be is a chance to really slow down and dive into the Psalms in a less academic way. We'll start out academic the way that we have been. We've got a scholar interview with Rolf Jacobson from Luther Seminary, Matt's colleague, actually Matt's boss at Luther Seminary. And then we will have interviews featuring people from the congregation, staff members, church members, and get a chance to dive into different ways of exploring the Psalms. There'll be more information coming up about how to sign up for Church in the Round, but it's a 5-week small group experience that we're hoping that you'll participate in. It will be in lieu of our Sunday morning classes. Okay, so let's dive in. First, let's start. I'm just going to ask this as a large group. And Bonnie, if you're able to walk around with the mic, that would be great. What are some stories that you can name from the prophet Ezekiel? When you think of the prophet Ezekiel, are there any particular stories that you associate with him? Yes, I see over here. We've got Carol. Okay. The wheel, okay, the vision of the wheel. And we will, for the sake of the live streamers, we will ask you to, or I can just repeat back too, the vision of the wheel, right? We'll see that at the beginning. Yes, and Kathy's got a...
Those dry bones.
The dry bones, right, the valley of the dry bones. Those are kind of the big two. Anybody else have any Ezekiel stories that you remember? Okay. That's okay. There's a reason that we don't spend much time in this book. We'll see why. I'm gonna submit that there will be other stories worth hearing and paying attention to, but I'm wondering if there's anywhere else that you have encountered Ezekiel. Perhaps somewhere in the grocery store. Yeah? Anybody know Ezekiel 4:9 in the cereal aisle? In the bread aisle. Anybody have Ezekiel bread in their house right now? Never heard of it. Okay. Ezekiel bread is this, it's this organic bread. It's made of these 6 grains that are these ancient grains. And it's called Ezekiel 4:9 because it's taken from this verse in the prophet Ezekiel. And it's this health food. So I'm going to ask somebody if you could read this verse to us. Does anybody have a Bible? Well, yes. Okay, we've got Donna in the back. Let's get her a microphone. Read Ezekiel 4:9 for us, if you would.
And you take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them into one vessel, and make bread for yourself. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days, you shall eat it.
Excellent. So you've named the 6 grains for us and the context in which Ezekiel's going to be eating that. And actually stay near Donna with the microphone because I'm going to ask you to read the rest of the passage. And I am sorry to do this because you are such a respectable person. But I'm going to ask you to keep going up till verse 15. If you can't do it, you can pass the mic. But if you wouldn't mind.
Alrighty. The food that you eat shall be 20 shekels a day by weight. At fixed times you shall eat it. And you shall drink water by measure, 1/6 of a hin. At fixed times you shall drink. You shall eat it as a barley cake, baking it in their sight on human dung. The Lord said, Thus shall the people of Israel eat their bread, unclean, among the nations to which I will drive them. Then I said, Lord God, I have never defiled myself. From my youth up until now, I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by animals, nor has carrion flesh come into my mouth. Then he said to me, See, I will let you have cow's dung instead of human dung, on which you may prepare your bread.
Thank you. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so we have a prize for you for being willing to read that, so thank you. I had to make someone else do that so I didn't get caught saying dung out loud on camera. So what is going on here, right? First of all, this is one of my favorite examples of a biblical verse being taken out of context and marketed as health food. I think this is hilarious because within the context of Scripture, it's actually it's Ezekiel being required by God to eat food that will symbolize uncleanness. So the human dung is actually, it's the fuel for the fire on which the cake is cooked, right? And we see Ezekiel negotiating with God down to cow's dung, which I guess is less gross, as the fuel for the fire on which to cook this bread that's meant to symbolize uncleanness. So I use this as an example of the kind of weird and wild and disturbing stuff, and unfortunately it's going to get more disturbing than this, but of the weirdness and the wildness of the prophet Ezekiel. So let's take a look at the big 3 prophets compared. These are Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. The Christian Bible adds Daniel as the 4th of the major prophets. In the Jewish ordering of the scriptures, Daniel actually doesn't show up until later in the writing. So we're just going to look at Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel to do a little review of the differences between them. So here we have Isaiah in Michelangelo's depiction. Here's Jeremiah. And here's Ezekiel, right? So Isaiah is, he's sort of circumspect. He's listening to this angel on his shoulder. He's got his finger in a book, another finger cocked. His legs are crossed. You know, he's attentive. He's distinguished, but he's relaxed in a certain way. And then Jeremiah, how would you describe Jeremiah's affect here? He's mourning, he's remorseful, he's somber, he's sad. This is Jeremiah of lamentation, right? We encounter Jeremiah at the end of December. And then we get Ezekiel, who is just wild and twisted. His body is sort of contorted. He's got this intense look on his face as he listens to that angel. He's sort of white-knuckling, his scroll in his hand. His shawl is sort of flying out behind him in the wind. There's a wildness to Ezekiel. And I like the way that Michelangelo has depicted these three prophets sort of according to their different kinds of personalities. And so let's locate Ezekiel in our timeline. This is Matt's original creation that we just keep extending and extending. So we had the United Monarchy, Saul, David, Solomon. It divides into a northern and southern kingdom. And then the northern kingdom, Israel, falls to this great empire, the Assyrians. Judah keeps on going, and then Judah falls to the Babylonians. There's a time of exile in Babylon. And then Cyrus of Persia allows the return of the Judeans from captivity. They're allowed to return. And then after that, we're going to get into Second Temple Judaism. And really starting next week, we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. First Isaiah comes here out of the south, but at the time of the fall of the north. Second Isaiah comes here. Remember this rejoicing of Second Isaiah from the time of the end of the captivity and the return to the land. Jeremiah, right at the time of the fall, right? This is the sadness of Jeremiah. Amos, which we looked at the week before last, actually we went back in time a little bit to see Amos. He's a prophet he was prophesying in the northern kingdom. We have a number of chairs up front, and you're welcome to sort of come around the side door. It's, fills in from the back. And so now let's look at where we find Ezekiel. So notice that Judah falls to the Babylonians in 586 BCE, but about 10 years before, 597, the first wave of exiles was taken to Babylon. King Jehoiachin was in this group, and the prophet Ezekiel was among this group. So Ezekiel actually gets taken away into exile before the rest of Jerusalem falls, but before the city is destroyed. So here are his dates here. And so he's writing from exile, and he's writing at a time before the big fall happens. And we'll see in the book a shift in the prophecies before and after the fall of Jerusalem. So it's important to sort of remember the context here and the trauma that he's experiencing as a person, and the trauma that he's seeing his people experience really informs and shapes these writings. This is why they are so wild and often so disturbing. So let's start with Ezekiel's call. This is a common form in the prophetic stories. We had a call of Isaiah, a call of Jeremiah. So here's Ezekiel's call. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month. So I highlighted a bunch of stuff in here because there's a lot of the way that Ezekiel begins actually gives us a lot of signals about what goes on here. So it begins with this very specific timestamp. We don't get such specific timestamps by and large from the other prophets, right? We got Isaiah, we got in the year that King Uzziah died, but for the most part, we're sort of guessing about where in a range of years those prophets are prophesying. Not so with Ezekiel. He tells us the year and the month and the day. The 30th year Ezekiel was probably 30 years old at the time. The rest of his dates will actually date from the years since he was taken into exile. So a little bit later, the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, that's like year 0 for Ezekiel when things begin, is 597. So this initial call happens 5 years into that initial exile period. The rest of Jerusalem won't fall for another 5 years after that. So then he goes on. As I was among the exiles by the river Chebar. So this is in Babylon. He's among the exiles, and this river is sort of a drainage canal dug by the Babylonians. The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Visions is going to be a big category of the material in Ezekiel. These wild visions will be a big part of what we'll see from him. And so then he names the date again with a little more clarity about what date he means. The word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar. So he names himself as a priest. That's his social location. And he's actually a Zadokite. Being the son of Buzi puts him in the category of being a Zadokite priest. This was a high priestly caste. They got to do the most important stuff in the temple. They were also pretty committed to the fact that the temple would not fall because the presence of God was there. You may remember from the prophet Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah is having arguments with other prophets about whether it was possible for the temple to be destroyed. And a lot of his contemporaries were saying, actually, temple can never fall. We're protected by God. It will not fall. And then, of course, the theological crisis comes when the temple does fall. And we saw some of this same logic in the book of 1 Samuel, right? If we take the Ark of the Covenant into battle with us, we can't be defeated by the Philistines. And then they are defeated and the Ark is captured. So it's this real crisis of it's not just a military crisis, it's a crisis of faith because the presence of God was thought to protect the people. And so he's part of this class of priests that's really committed to the temple of the Lord being the place where God's presence resides. We'll see this as a major concern of Ezekiel's here. We're also going to see a lot of concerns that will remind us of what we encountered in Leviticus. Questions of holy and common, questions of clean and unclean, questions of how the law is used by the priests and the people to sort of mediate and accommodate the presence of God in their midst. And so what comes to Ezekiel, so that's who Ezekiel is, right? And so what comes to him? The word of the Lord, oracles, visions, commands to perform these various sign acts, and then the hand of the Lord. That phrase, the hand of the Lord, is repeated again and again. And you can tell there's kind of like a heaviness on Ezekiel, that God's hand is strong on him. Ezekiel has to do a lot of things that he would not want to do because of the way that God is interacting with him and the things that God is requiring of him in order to get this message across. That's what to notice just from these first 3 verses, right? So what's the message that's coming across? Well, the message is the vision, and this is the vision that I think it was Kathy you pointed out with the wheel, Carol with the wheels. Yeah. So the opening vision of Ezekiel is this grand vision of these winged creatures, these wheels, this appearance of God. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually. And in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. I'm going to show a lot of different representations of this because it's hard to get a sense of visually, but it's worth seeing a lot of different artists kind of rendering of this. So this is the inaugural vision. So here's these 4 creatures. As for the appearance of their faces, the 4 had the face of a human being, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Does anybody know where else in the Bible we see these 4 creatures? Yes, Bill. In the book of Revelation. Yep, John of Patmos has a similar vision of these same 4 creatures. And Christians have adopted, this is just a little sidebar, but Christians have adopted these 4 creatures as symbols of the 4 Gospels. Has anybody seen that? They've said Matthew is a man, Mark is a lion, Luke is an ox. Luke being the sort of emphasizing the sort of servant leader concern for the poor and the working in Luke's gospel. And then John is an eagle who soars above the rest, right? John's gospel having this really sort of heightened view of Jesus. So this is one way that Christians have sort of captured this imagery in the book of Revelation. And then also if you're wandering through a church and you see those 4, they're often symbolizing the different evangelists. Okay, so back to Ezekiel. So he's looking at these living creatures, and he says, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like gleaming beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. Their rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. This is just this wild vision, wheels full of eyes. I think I cut this part, but there's burning coals involved. There's fire involved in this. It's very hard to depict, which is why you get so many different, what does it mean? How are the wheels exactly connected? You can't get too literal about this, but it is very, very vivid and very colorful. Over the heads of the living creatures was something like a dome, shining like crystal, spread out above their heads. We had a dome in the Bible, very close to the beginning. Does anybody know what the dome represents in the Bible in the very beginning? The heavens, yes, the firmament, right? The dome called sky that God creates. So there's this link to God as creator, right? We're getting these clues in the language of this vision that this is God here. Above the dome, there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seating above the likeness of a throne was something that seemed like a human form. Upwards from what appeared like the loins, I saw something gleaming amber, something that looked like fire enclosed all around. And downwards from what looked like the loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was splendor all around. Like the bow in the cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of splendor all around. Where's the bow in the cloud from? Noah's Ark, right? The bow that's put in the cloud after the flood. So this real connection to this divine appearance. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. So this is what's called a theophany. That's the fancy word for a divine appearance, this revelation. And there's aspects of theophany that are sort of both visible and hidden. There's this very vivid description, but also this verbal undercutting of it at the same time. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel is trying to show us what he's seen, but also recognizing that words fail him here. And the word glory is the word kavod, and it means this sort of cloud that both contains and hides God's presence, God's glory, this kavod. We saw it in Exodus. Where did we see a sort of cloud-like God in Exodus? Leading the people, yep. On Mount Sinai, there's a big cloud on Mount Sinai. When they set up the tent of meeting in the wilderness, God's cloud descends on the tent of meeting. So again, these sort of connections to Torah. So this is what he sees. And then after seeing this vision, he gets this call. When I saw it, I fell on my face and I heard the voice of someone speaking. He said to me, "O mortal." And this Ezekiel is called mortal all the time. It's what God calls Ezekiel most. It is also sometimes translated as son of man, but we don't mean that in the Messiah kind of way. Here, that son of man, that mortal, is to emphasize Ezekiel's mortality in contrast to God's divinity, right? Ezekiel and God are not on the same playing field here, and that's made very clear throughout this. So stand up on your feet and I will speak to you. And when he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and set me on my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. And again, this is this sort of physicality, right? The spirit enters him and lifts him up onto his feet. He said to me, "Mortal, I'm sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels." Again, this prophetic imagery of rebellion against God being why God is intervening in this way. "And they and their ancestors have transgressed against me to this very day. But you, mortal, hear what I say to you. Do not be like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you." I looked, and a hand was stretched out to me, and a written scroll was in it. He spread it before me. It had writing on the front and the back, and written on it were words of lamentation and mourning and woe. He said to me, O mortal, eat what is offered to you. Eat this scroll, and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. Then I ate it, and my mouth was as sweet as honey. Right? I mean, yes, this is Ezekiel's call. Eat this scroll. There's a physicality to it. There's this enactment, this bodily enactment. There's this over-the-top sort of absurdity to it, but there's also this real pathos, this words of lamentation and mourning and woe that taste as sweet as honey on his lips. This is Ezekiel's call, is to deliver these words to the people. Later, he will become silent, unable to speak until the news comes that Babylon falls. So Ezekiel has a very complicated relationship with the words that he's been commissioned to deliver. Let's talk about this style. So we've got these wild visions, right? And we can compare this a little bit if we think about back to Isaiah. When I was leading the class on 2nd Isaiah, we were really focused on hymns. We were focused on the sort of poetic nature of Isaiah's words, the way that they sounded, and the way that those showed up all over our hymnal. And you're not going to see Ezekiel in our hymnal in the same way that you saw Isaiah in the hymnal, but you do see there's tons of good art for Ezekiel. And Matt has given us a little preview that Daniel's going to have excellent art next week as well. But there's a lot of visual depictions of this because his mode is much more visual than oral. Which is why we get a lot of great Ezekiel paintings. And some of these wild visions, there's the chariot scene, the dry bones. We'll get to Gog and Magog later. And then there's these over-the-top sign acts as well. Eating the scroll. We'll see some other things that Ezekiel does. I've got a couple of illustrations of this. So this is Ezekiel performing one of his early sign acts. Can anybody see what he's got in his hand there? A scale. And then in his other hand, he's got something that looks like little strands of something. Anybody know what that is? That's his hair. So one of his early sign acts, he's commanded to give himself a haircut with a sword. And then take his hair and divide it into 3. And he's weighing it here to get it exactly accurate. To take 1/3 of that hair and burn it, 1/3 of that hair and slice it up with the sword, 1/3 of that hair to scatter it to the winds, and then a couple of hairs to put into his coat for safekeeping. And that's the symbol of what is to come, with 1/3 of the people dying of famine and pestilence, 1/3 of the people dying by the sword, 1/3 of the people going into exile, and a small remnant safe and secure. So this is one of those sign acts that carries this deep, intense, symbolic weight with it. And then here, he's had his haircut. What's he doing here? He's lying on his side. Yep, he has to lie first on his left side for 390 days, and then on his right side for 40 days. This is when he's assigned to eat the bread that Donna was talking about, the bread that represents uncleanness. And it's the bread of exile, the bread that the people will eat in exile. And he's looking at something. You can see a little bit arrayed before him that looks like a little brick on the ground. He's also been told to take a brick and make a model of the city, and then lay a siege work against it, make a model of the city being besieged, and then just stare at this for 390 days. You will be fixated on this. And it's this sort of symbolic, embodied enactment of the harm that's done. So scholars have asked, what's going on with Ezekiel, right? Is he suffering from some kind of mental illness? You know, if a person was doing this in our day and they were doing it at the MoMA, right, or sort of labeled as an art installation, we'd say that is public art. But if they were not, if they were just doing this on their own, we would probably assign them some kind of label of having some kind of mental illness. They would get a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and it's, you know, scholars have done this. Some scholars have tried to sort of label Ezekiel's condition in order to account for his behavior. And I think there's 2 difficulties with that approach. One is that it's sort of projecting back modern classifications of mental illness onto the ancient world. We're always going to run into trouble doing that. We are shaped by our own time and environment and understanding of what a human being is. It's hard to go back into the ancient world and project our modern categories onto that. But the other issue that I take with that is, and it's an issue that we have now too, is this. It pathologizes having visions and voices as mental illness. And in some ways, it kind of lets the culture off the hook, right? Ezekiel's not doing this because he's crazy. He's doing this because his world, his culture is falling apart. He is calling his people to live a different way. He's delivering this very serious message. And I think sometimes we put on the individual the pathologies that actually belong to the culture. I just read a great book called The Book of Form and Emptiness. Has anybody read this book? It's a recent fiction book, and it's about a boy who hears objects talking to him. But he's living with a mom who is what would be called a hoarder, who collects and amasses lots of objects in her house. And the book is not as much an examination of this boy's mental illness as it is a question about American material culture. Why do we have all of this stuff? What's our relationship to all of this stuff? And how do we understand that in a way that is empathetic and tender toward individuals who, from one end or the other, have challenges dealing with how much accumulated stuff there is in this world? And I want to invite us to extend that kind of empathy to Ezekiel and not necessarily immediately cast him off as somebody who's suffering from mental illness, and to say, what is he trying to say to his people? There are some things that it's hard to excuse him for. Don't read chapter 16. Don't read chapter 23. I read them in preparation for this, and it's just those both contain extended metaphors that involve prostitution. that portray Israel and Judah as unfaithful wives to God. And there's a lot of violence in these metaphors. There's a lot of sexualized shaming in these metaphors. They are really hard to read. Maggie Odell will talk about this some in the video, what it means to sort of read them in their context, understand them in their context. But I have a favorite tool for passages like this, and I don't use this tool often, but it's a stapler, right? It's not scissors. You don't cut the passages out, but you just staple the pages of your Bible shut so you don't have to read those chapters. That might be an extreme. I don't know if this is an approach that Matt would recommend. But my friend Kip, when he was a little kid, he was afraid of snakes. He's still afraid of snakes. But when he was a little kid, he subscribed to Ranger Rick. And when Ranger Rick came home, his mom would read it first and staple together all the pages that had snakes on them, which is what I would do with those passages of Ezekiel. No, they're very hard. It is very troubling to find those in this book. And I don't want to pass by and say this is not in there because it's a real, this is really challenging stuff to find. The other thing, though, there's this wild style, some of it very disturbing. But then there's also this real structure to Ezekiel, almost more than any of the other prophets. Remember, Jeremiah, it sort of feels like somebody just like dropped a lot of passages on the floor and then sewed them back together in a scroll. But Ezekiel is much more orderly. So in spite of the wild style, there's a highly structured content to Ezekiel. And so there's these regular timestamps. We saw one at the beginning. There are repeated refrains that he uses again and again. You shall know that I am the Lord, calling Ezekiel mortal, doing things for the sake of my holy name. And then there's just a really orderly outline. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's a very structured book. And so what we take from this is that Ezekiel was actually likely originally a written composition. Isaiah, Jeremiah, probably delivered orally as these oracles, this poetry. Ezekiel was probably written down in its original form, maybe edited later, but likely began its life as a written document with this structure and this order. Maybe Ezekiel's diary during the exile. We actually don't know how public he was. We don't have contemporaneous records of some guy, Ezekiel, acting these things out. So we don't really know what it was like on the ground, but in terms of its composition, we're pretty sure that it was written down first. Here's the outline. So we begin with pre-destruction prophecies. We've seen a lot of these already. His call, a bunch of oracles against Judah and Israel. We've seen this in other prophets, these calls to change their ways. God's glory departs from the temple. We'll go back to this in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then we get these oracles against foreign nations. He turns his focus in chapter 25 from Israel and Judah to the other nations and talks about the punishments that will come on the other nations, and primarily for their mockery and their refusal to help Israel and Judah. And then in 33, we really have this turn towards these post-destruction prophecies. He talks about the fall of Jerusalem and how that happens. He gets word, but then transitions very quickly into oracles of promise and hope. And then it ends with this beautiful vision of restoration of the city. There's a new temple, a new Jerusalem, and then the return of God's glory. God's glory comes back to the city. So we can see this structure, and then there's a beginning and an end and a middle. And these key moments, where is God's glory, is the sort of governing structural principle of Ezekiel. So his oracles against Judah, what's the diagnosis? How do we diagnose Ezekiel, right? But how does Ezekiel diagnose what's going wrong in his culture? So he uses sign acts to do this. We've seen some of these about the lying on the side, the haircut. He's at one point commanded to pack a suitcase and dig through the wall to symbolize exile. And he'll prophesy about the coming end, about God's anger, God's judgment, God's intention to punish and not to spare. And then there's a lot of allegories, a lot of symbolic language here. Eagles coming and carrying off the tops of cedar trees, the city of Jerusalem as a pot of meat that will be boiled. And then we've already talked about this, the allegory of the unfaithful wife, a lot of symbolic language that he's using here. And his diagnosis, a lot of it, because of his priestly location, is focused on improper worship, abominations in the sanctuary, other gods or idols that have been put up in the middle of the sanctuary in Jerusalem, idolatry, violations of the law, corrupt leaders. He's got a long section about the corrupt shepherds. We'll see that quoted elsewhere in the Bible, but the corrupt kings of Israel and Judah. And then the corrupt people. The people are not off the hook here. They're not just being led astray. They're also complicit in their own demise. And then some of this is what we would think of as moral categories. People robbing and oppressing the poor, people failing to give bread to the hungry or clothing to the naked, not sort of fulfilling their social justice obligations to others. It's hard to separate these out. We're always tempted to separate moral from ritual law. But as Anna Marsh reminded us when we were studying Leviticus back in our study of the law, these things are not severable. These go together as a way of living in covenant with God. Lending an interest is another example. So this is his diagnosis of what's going wrong here. And then in chapter 8, he has this temple vision. We have another timestamp. The hand of the Lord comes upon him, and he looked, and there's a figure that looks like a human being, and below its loins was fire, above its loins brightness like glowing amber. We've seen that before. This appearance stretches out in the form of a hand and takes him by a lock of his head. His hair must have grown back at this point, and lifts him up between heaven and earth and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem. So he's still in exile, but this spirit brings him to a vision of Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, to the seat of the image of jealousy. So that's probably a reference to some kind of abomination, to some other idol or statue or something that's present in the temple. And the glory of Israel the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I'd seen in the valley. So he's connecting this to to the vision that he had at the beginning. That's Ezekiel being lifted up by his hair. This is from the Dura Europa synagogue, which is one of the earliest Jewish representations we have of religious art. So then he's taken to the temple where he sees a very violent scene occurring. The Spirit calls executioners near, and 6 men come from the north. One man comes with a writing case and marks on the forehead of anybody that has been weeping over Jerusalem. Anybody who's sad about the abominations that have been happening here gets marked to be spared, and then everyone else gets executed. So we've seen this before, this sort of marking on the doorposts in the Exodus story of who to spare. We'll see marking in the book of Revelation. There's this sort of division of who is to be spared and who is not. And then at the end, the chariot rises up over the temple and pauses there. He sees this vision of the creatures and the wheels. I don't know if it's quite right to call it a chariot. A lot of artists have sort of envisioned it that way, but it pauses there. The man in linen who had been sort of showing Ezekiel around takes fire from the wheels and burns the city. And then the glory of the Lord departs from the temple, stops above the cherubim, and then departs from the city entirely. So the cherubim lifted up their wings, and with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the Lord of Israel was above them. And the glory of the Lord ascended from the middle of the city, stopped at the mountain east of the city. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea to the exiles. Then the vision that I had seen left me, and I told the exiles the things that the Lord had showed me. So what Ezekiel sees there is God departing from the city, God leaving the city. And this is a crisis, right? It means that God has abandoned the city. And this is a trope in the ancient world. When a city was attacked, it meant that its God had abandoned it. And usually what happened is that God would sort of go up into heaven or go and do something else. But in this case, there's a difference that happens here, because the God who'd abandoned the city is the same God from that initial vision who showed up to Ezekiel, right? That's God coming to the exiles to be with them in exile. So even though this seems like a very desolate vision, and it is, there's an element of hopefulness, right? Though I removed them far away among the nations, and though I scattered them among the countries, yet I have been a sanctuary to them for a little while in the countries where they have gone. So this is God's promise to be with the exiles in exile. And this is a new development. Remember, everybody was really convinced that God was going to stay with the temple, and God's departure from the temple is a theological crisis. This is an explanation or an answer to that. And there's a promise of restoration. I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out, and I will give you the land. There's a promise of return. We often get in the prophets this promise of return. I will give them one heart and a new spirit. Remove the heart of stone, put in a heart of flesh. And then this refrain we see all over the Bible, they shall be my people and I will be their God. There's an enduringness to the relationship. This is not the final word. And I'm going to skip over, well, I'll do a little bit of this part. So, no, this is too much. I want to give us some time to discuss at the end. So the short answer here, the short version of this is that Ezekiel is actually a voice that's distinct from the other voices of some of the other theologies of the Bible, in that he doesn't believe that the sins of the parents will fall on the children, that people are punished for their own sin. This is not heritable. The good news of that is that you can turn around. That the wicked will not always be wicked, and that the righteous can't rest in their own righteousness, right? That God is sort of attentive to all of the people's acts all of the time. In chapter 24, we get this turning point. We get another timestamp, we get another allegory, and then we get a sign act, which is one of the most sort of moving and difficult sign acts in the whole book. Ezekiel's wife dies, and God says, mortal, with one blow, first of all, he's married, which you don't know until that point. You're like, really, okay, who is Mrs. Ezekiel? That would be a hard life, I think. But God says to him, mortal, with one blow, I'm about to take away from you the delight of your eyes. Yet you shall not mourn or weep, nor shall your tears run down. Sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the dead. So I spoke to the people in the morning. In the evening, my wife died. And the next morning, I did as I was commanded. And this is a command not to weep over the destruction of Jerusalem. This is the meaning of that sign act, is God's not going to weep over the ending of God's beloved here. And Ezekiel gets this command that is simultaneously the lowest point, but also the turning point, because he's told that he's going to receive notice that Jerusalem has fallen, that the thing that everybody is worried about has taken place. And this is going to be the lowest moment of the book. Then we shift to oracles against the nations. The attention is turned elsewhere. If we remember from the way that Amos started, we started with oracles against the nations and then turned towards Judah and Israel. Here, it's the opposite. We begin with oracles against Judah and then turn towards oracles against the nations. This indicates that God has power not only over God's covenant people, but over the whole world. So again, these are meant to, there's a way in which this is meant to be a sort of uplifting image, because it shows God is in charge of the whole of history here. And what you're experiencing now is not the end. And then this moves into oracles of restoration, chapters 33 and following. We get another timestamp. This is January 19th, 585. So this is right after the destruction in 586. And then we get a fugitive comes from Jerusalem to bring exiles the news of destruction. We get some familiar oracles here. Here's the Valley of Dry Bones. And often this is taken by Christians to be a resurrection oracle. We think this means the dead will be raised, right? It's often read in churches that do an Easter vigil as one of the stories of the Easter vigil, to say, here is a foretaste of the resurrection from the dead. But in the context of Ezekiel, it really is about God doing this new thing that restores the people to the land. It's not a sort of abstract, the dead will no longer die. It really is specifically this people will be brought home. And then we also have this vision of Gog is it Magog or Magog? Matt, how do you pronounce this? Magog, Gog of Magog. It was one of those words I pronounced wrong in my head for the first time. Like I said Captain Ahab in Moby Dick before learning it was Ahab. So I'm going to just be, so Gog of Magog, which is this powerful king, foreign king from the north, who is then destroyed who tries to destroy the people, but is then destroyed by God. This is God taking vengeance. And it's not just the sort of Jeremiah, the tables will turn kind of way. This is where we get the sort of beginnings or hints of a kind of apocalyptic vision. I don't know that you would say it's fully developed in Ezekiel, but we get things like the rain of fire and sulfur, mountains quaking, pestilence and bloodshed, thunderstorms and hailstorms. This is a sort of end times vision of this power, this great earthly power being thrown down. It has engendered all kinds kinds of speculation. People like to say, who is Gog? Is it Bill Clinton? This is something that Christians have just had a field day with over the years. Probably he's referring to Babylon, right? That's where he is in his historical context. But Ezekiel has lent itself to a lot of creative interpretation over the years, and including, we'll see in a little bit, by the book of Revelation in the New Testament. So then we get restoration, another timestamp. And the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel are great. You should read the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel. They'll be a lot of fun. The hand of the Lord brought Ezekiel to a high mountain to see the city, and there was a man there with a linen cord. All the guides have linen on. I didn't look into why, but that's a trope. And this long measuring rod, 6 cubits long. And he basically takes Ezekiel on this architectural tour of the restored city and measures the whole thing. How big the walls are, how big the temple is, this very detailed vision of what the restored city will be like. And there's just this beauty to the repeated measurements that are part of this. So he measures the walls, the gateways, the vestibules, the outer courts, and the chambers, the east gate, the south gate, the north gate. I think there's a west gate too. I don't know why I didn't put that in there. There's the place for preparing the sacrifices, so the renewal of sacrificial worship will take place here. There'll be chambers for singers and priests and people who work the temple. And there's the temple, and there with the nave and the inner room, the most holy place. This is the holiest of holies that we can remember from the construction of the first temple. And the temple has a wall around it, 500 cubits long and 500 cubits wide, to make a separation between the holy and the common. And this is important, right? This is an important part of the priestly understanding of what it takes for God to dwell among the people, is that most of the stuff of the world is common, and God is holy. God is this powerful life force. And there needs to be a space for God to reside among the people. So this is good news for the people. And then we get another theophany. The glory of the Lord was coming from the east. God returns to the temple. Ezekiel's told to tell the rest of Israel about this plan for the temple and that its ordinances will be carried out. And the Zadokites, the priestly caste that Ezekiel is from, are going to serve in the temple. They shall teach the people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between clean and unclean. This sort of technology of law that mediates between the people and God, so that people can safely come before the Lord or priests on their behalf, so that it's really this restoration of relationship is what is being signaled here. And so God has returned, and this is good news. This is an illustration of the heavenly Jerusalem from the book of Revelation, which imagines it's a different kind of symbolism. The city sort of descends from heaven to John of Patmos, but it imagines a similar kind of future restoration. There's this orderly allotment of the land among the 12 tribes. It was never this orderly, but there's this vision that all the 12 tribes will have their space, they'll get along. There's a holy portion set aside for the Lord. There's land set aside for the prince, so there's going to be this restoration of political rule as well, although it's very clear that the prince is to be subordinate to the priests in this. The prince is responsible for bringing a lot of the offerings for the temple worship, and the priests are the ones who conduct it. And then there's this wonderful little detail that we should not miss, because we're going to see a different voice in a couple of weeks, but that foreigners, they're not allowed in the temple. That's part of Ezekiel's vision of what the temple is like. But if they shall be given an inheritance in the land, if a foreigner and an Israelite have children together, those children should be allowed to inherit. There is room for outsiders within the land. That's contested. We'll see later on different visions of this, but I wanted to just name that here in Ezekiel. And then there's this beautiful vision of a river. Water flows out from the threshold of the temple, just out of the temple building, eastward towards the east and the south. And the guide leads him through, and Ezekiel's in the water up to his ankles, and then up to his knees, and then up to waist deep. And then the river becomes so deep that you could swim in it. It flows into the Dead Sea, and it makes that Dead Sea run fresh. It's full of fish, and there are trees along its banks, and the fruit of those trees is for food, and the leaves of the tree are for healing. The leaves of the tree are for healing. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Does anybody know where that line is from? Revelation. Yeah, there was a Horizons Bible study a couple of years ago, I think, called "The Leaves of the Tree Are for the Healing of the Nations." Revelation is going to pick up a lot of this imagery from Ezekiel. So we end with this beautiful vision of the city really watering the rest of the country, expanding, overflowing into the countryside. This vision of abundance, and then the last line: "The name of the city from that time on shall be the Lord is there." So the final close of Ezekiel brings home this message of God's presence in the city, and specifically God's presence linked to location, right? We have often seen God with us. This is God with the city, God with the land. God is there in the city is the kind of final vision of Ezekiel. So it comes home and it comes together at the end. So that was a lot. We had some highs and lows here. I want us to spend about just a couple minutes, maybe about 3 minutes, in a small group with your table and ask this question: how do we understand Ezekiel's legacy? What does a prophet like this contribute to our canon? The sort of question that came from this table at the beginning: why should this be in here? What do we learn from Ezekiel, and what do we not like about Ezekiel, or what do we reject about Ezekiel? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and we'll come back as a full group. And Mark, you're welcome to join in if you want. Okay, I'm hearing discussion ongoing, but I'm gonna bring us back. And Bonnie, I'm gonna ask if you wouldn't mind moving the mic around again. Any thoughts from your tables that you wanted to share with the group? How do we understand this prophet and his place in our canon?
I told my table that I had a question for you, so
Sure,
I'm going to raise it. Sometimes in the Older Testament, the glory of the Lord is seen as a feminine presence. Now, we didn't get that in the work of art that you were displaying,
that
and I
definitely,
don't
yeah.
think we usually do, but
Yeah.
is there any sense in which that could help deepen our understanding of what Ezekiel is saying?
Yeah, no.
Especially when you think of the death of his wife being associated with the departure of the glory.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think in Ezekiel, he's a little bit loins focused when we're talking about that image of the Lord, to be honest. I think in Ezekiel's vision of the glory of the Lord is pretty male, and the sort of the marriage metaphor of Israel and God is kind of heteronormative in Ezekiel, but I would be interested in exploring whether either within Ezekiel or in other places that glory is understood in a more feminine way. I know Sophia, wisdom, if we talk about Proverbs, there's a really feminized version of who's doing the creation at the beginning. There are definitely places. I would need to do a little more research before I knew whether Ezekiel was one of them. But my guess is, unfortunately, that he's not as much of that. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Yes.
I was just sharing with my group, how do we understand Ezekiel's legacy? That maybe his visions and they're so fantastic. It's preparing us for the fantastic, unusual, raising of the dead of Christ. Prepare yourself to suspend belief.
Yeah.
And get in touch with the fantastic. So I also love that it's not a tidy book. It got in the Bible.
It made its way in, yes.
Which is awesome, right?
Yeah.
I think that is respects the intelligence of the readers.
Yeah. So I think Christians over the years really have sort of seen that in Ezekiel, especially the Valley of Dry Bones. I've always found that story has always felt a little scary to me. The idea of sort of skeletons getting flesh back on them and then coming back to life. But in Christian imagination, that is it's understood to be a very hopeful story. And what I love about your comment is this invitation to imagination in reading and understanding Ezekiel. I think there can be a tendency sometimes in sort of modern Protestant churches to demand logic of our faith and to give more credence to things that are more like our sort of everyday, mundane, real world experience. And the presence of Ezekiel says, faith is way bigger than that. Faith is not just a matter of mind, it's a matter of heart and of imagination, and playfulness, and envisioning things beyond what is possible is actually a really important part of faith. And I do think Ezekiel is a real invitation to that. So yeah, thank you for that comment. Other thoughts? Yes, I see Carol at the front.
Thank you. Based in part about this most recent conversation here, I've been wondering all along if the point of including Ezekiel in the canon is that he is so imaginative and so gritty that he's able to draw individuals into the story. People read it for different reasons, but they get excited about the story. And there were some hints, I thought, throughout, even in your presentation, but in the reading of Ezekiel, that it's the first time I remember it being the prophets speaking to individuals, not just the nation or the people of God, but kind of drawing individual examples. So I wondered, my basic thought when I was doing this on my own was, okay, so this guy's a marketer. In essence, he's figured out a way to give the message that will draw in many individuals, no matter whether they have been faithful or unfaithful or wavering on the edge or whatever. He's speaking in ways that pull on each person, each reader separately.
What word did you say that he is like a
marketer?
Marketer, yes, yep. That there's something that he's doing that speaks to people, and
differently.
Yeah, differently. And there's a beautiful book. I don't know if you guys have read Lila by Marilyn Robinson. Perhaps you've read Gilead, which if you have not read Gilead, go to the library on your way home from church and read Gilead. It is a beautiful, beautiful book. This is a sequel. Gilead is about a pastor in rural Iowa. Lila is about his wife, who he meets late in life. She sort of wanders into his church. You don't realize it as much in Gilead, but in Lila you realize that she is basically somebody who has lived her life as a migrant worker. She's been on the edge of homelessness. And so there's this real gap in their experiences of life. And she picks up a Bible to learn to read the Bible, but also to learn to write by copying out the words of the Bible. And she starts with the prophet Ezekiel. And they have this hilarious this conversation sort of late in the story where he's like, Ezekiel, that's an interesting choice, And I said, I might recommend you read Matthew as well. Clearly he's a little worried about her starting with this book. But she identifies with the experience of being a desolation, of being considered deplorable by the rest of society, this experience of shame that Ezekiel depicts. And she says, yeah, that's my understanding of the world, and he has named that here. And so she finds a great deal of comfort in this. And so that perspective has kind of helped me see the ways that this might speak to people who are in a different situation than I've been in, but that she really, this character really takes to the book of Ezekiel for that reason, which I think is interesting. Yes, we have another thought over here.
I'm hoping that my group will correct me if I'm wrong. They've appointed me the spokesperson. We talked about the idea that God was not physically located in Jerusalem, and that we liked your explanation that he was going with the people into exile. So this new idea that God is with everyone, is that kind of, okay.
Yeah, yep. So God was not bound to the place, but could go with the people, that God was connected to the people. Yeah, I think that's beautifully established in Ezekiel. There does remain this connection to place at the end, this hopefulness of return, but that God's departure is not abandonment of the people. And I think that's beautifully captured by what your group said. Yeah, we see Bill over there. And then I think we'll have to wrap up.
One of the things that struck me was that as we were talking about this, Ezekiel as an author seems to be unitary rather than, maybe there were several authors of Isaiah or other prophets. But this really does seem to be unitary. And if it was written contemporaneously with the experiences that the people were having, he would be trying to answer the question, what in the world is happening to us? How did this happen? And looking for a way back.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a really good point. And we think that somebody edited Ezekiel. Everybody got edited at some point, but there's a real unity to his voice, and we do think it's a pretty close to contemporaneous account, in part because of when he starts to get things wrong. His vision of the restored city will actually look different from what we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, which we'll describe more closely to what actually happened. He gets the number of years wrong. He has Judah lying on its side he lies on his side 40 days for Judah to symbolize 40 years of exile. We know is actually closer to 70 years, right? So there's, which in some ways, when you get sort of historic errors in the Bible like that, it actually gives you credence to, okay, we actually do think this is a contemporaneous account. Here's what he could see. Here's what he couldn't see. And I think his voice is this authentic voice of the moment of trauma and distress. I want to share one little story. I have baptized an Ezekiel. I baptized a kid named Ezekiel. My friend Hannah, if you were here at the time of my installation, my friend Hannah came and preached my installation. Her son is named Ezekiel, and she asked me to baptize him. And so I did, and I said, tell me the story of his name, because it's not a usual name for a kid now.